Hey everybody, how we doing? I'd ask if you can hear me in the back, but we don't have a back anymore. So can you hear me in the middle? Yeah. Oh gosh, wow, you warmed up for me, thank you. Okay, so we're a ways through the day. We've had most of our talks, a lot's gone on, and we just had a bunch of cake, maybe feeling a bit soporific. I won't make you get up. But I'd like to do a bit of a recap. So this morning, so you remember this when you leave, and it's not just in one ear and out the other. Double session to start. We had games being built and got to play with some rovers and Sonic Pi in the other room. We talked about what we need as developers in the West Country and in Cornwall, and we shared our thoughts. We danced, and we made our art with another workshop. Thank you very much. Enjoyed the boogieing. We covered Internet of Things and AI and natural language processing by someone who knows a lot more about chatbots than I do, and that is literally going to be the crux of my talk. But luckily they left, so I'm going to sound smart. We talked about big data that is larger than I'll ever have to deal with, and the problems facing that with some fascinating products and ways to approach it. And then, of course, we talked about what we can do as developers beyond what we're already doing with our code skills to help people in the health sector and our communities and be able to give back, but also do it in a commercial sense as well. And I finally got to see a real-life Paro. I don't know if anyone in here has seen Master of None on Netflix, but that featured in an entire episode, and I've been dying to see one, but I know at 5,000 pounds is unlikely that they're just going to be knocking about. And of course, now we're full of cake and coffee. And here we are. Today, I'm going to be talking about preparing for a natural disaster using Ruby and Twilio. And as a disclaimer, even though I feature the language and you'll see a few screenshots with it throughout, this is a language agnostic talk. Anything that I'm going to be talking about, you can do in any language but for Scratch. The order of the day is going to be first, walking through a natural disaster to explore a technical problem. This is going to be the extreme case that we're going to discuss. Then we're going to discuss helping that problem with the aid of Ruby and Twilio. You see the little meat emoji there? That's the meat of the talk, the fun part. I don't have memes, but I have emojis. Then we're going to cover the outcomes, retrospectives, observations, and how you can get involved with this project. But as a bit more of an overarching piece here, I'm going to be walking through building essentially a product. And I'm going to be doing that here with you today. I'm going to identify the problem, how I tackled the problem, and how I tried to solve it, and what the next steps are. For a bit more background on me, who am I? As you can tell by my accent, I'm not Cornish. I am originally from Montana in the United States. That's my feet right there on top of a mountain in July. You see all the snow still on the mountain. I lived in the Rocky Mountains in a county about the size of Cornwall, but we only had about 3,000 people. I lived in the biggest town in that county of 700 people. So I was a city boy when I grew up. Now I live here in Lostwithiel, lovely Lostwithiel. So I traded in the Rocky Mountains for the sea, but was able to retain a sense of community. So I don't know who all here has been in Lostwithiel much, but there is throughout the town a sense of place. And even in Cornwall, more than others, where I'm from, being a Montanan meant something. I think here when people talk about being Cornish, that means something as well, and it's something I very much appreciate, even though I will never be Cornish, I understand. And I work here. I work at Oceans HQ, which is a maritime tech company based out of Tor Point, so on the almost Devon side of the county, and we ship maritime registration software to national governments exclusively, and I think we have about 9 nations using our software. So if you own an oil tanker or a pleasure yacht or a cargo vessel, containerized vessel, and you flag in any one of those 9 countries, you are registered, inspected, and surveyed exclusively using our software. So if you have any interest in talking about procuring to national governments or talking about shipping or registration of vessels, please hit me up after. I could talk your ear off about it all day, but today's talk has absolutely nothing to do about where I work, which is the best bit. This is being recorded, isn't it? That wasn't. Okay, anyway, so part 1, problems waiting to happen. I think we can remember, we probably have some O2 users here in the room. I was at one of their customers. Last year, we had a major data outage. This happens generally. In fact, I think there was a smaller one just the other day. But we had 30 million people in the United Kingdom with no access to data for an incredibly long period of time. And for those of you who were O2 customers who have experienced outages, I've driven to a part of Cornwall where I can't get access and I expect it, but right in the middle of your day, it's a bit of a wake-up call. And a few days later, people kind of moved on as if nothing had happened. But for me, it was a massive wake-up call because at the very, very best of times, it was annoying, right? I couldn't look up Reddit or Twitter on the train. I couldn't download new podcasts. It's like, whatever. But I was just in a normal day. But even under normal circumstances, we have in the last decade really married our lives to the expectation of connectivity and the expectation of access to data. All the mobile apps on our phone that we use link into this. We were talking about the loss of connectivity and being able to sync that earlier, which hopefully will be something that can help address these problems going forward. And if you just think about not too long ago, I've only had a smartphone for 7 years. There was a time where you would print out your maps or bring a road atlas in your car. There was a time where you'd have a Rolodex of phone numbers to contact people or know who to talk to if you needed to call to get help. Now you don't even know phone numbers if you can't get access to them. So that's the best case. It's mildly annoying. Say that you have a flight check-in that you have to get done. Say that you're going up to London and you have to get your meeting notes or find the location of the office you have to see, but you have no data and you can't trust the Wi-Fi on the train. Now let's make this a little more extreme. Let's say that there's a natural disaster or a political attack or a terror attack and that there's a larger crisis. This is a case where you're much more likely to not have connectivity to the outside world with data. This is much more of a reality, especially in the third world, but it is also the time that you need that connectivity more than ever. You don't need to just update your Facebook or your Twitter. You need to see what your national government is saying to you. You need to know how to get around. You need to know if there's another hurricane coming on the back of the last one. But you don't have this. We know with the current infrastructure in this country that networks over 3 different protocols with voice, SMS, and data. Voice and data are the first to go down, and they are the hardest hit when being used en masse. When something bad happens, everyone's making a phone call, everyone's trying to access Facebook, it fills up fast. But SMS is incredibly tiny and far less burdensome on the networks. Also, SMS has the unique property of being able to be stored and delivered at a later time. If you try and access 4G now, and you have no access, that's the endpoint. If you try to make a phone call now, you get no voicemail, you get no connectivity, that's the endpoint. SMS can be held until the time that the pipeline is clear and delivered. So, what do I know? I know that I can write web applications. I know I can connect things together. I know I can put code on a server. I also know that there's ways to hook this up to SMS for SMS interface. The first SMS application I ever built was exclusively for myself and my wife. When I don't know how to name something, I put Schwad in the front, because that's my last name, Schwaderer. And we have, for 2 years now, been managing all of our budgeting via SMS. We go in a web app once a month, and we enter in our budget, and then we are able to manage it by text for the rest of the month. So for example, if we were out in the pub, and I had no data or anything, I would write social, comma, that would be the name of the pot of money, 14 pound, comma, and then a memo, say, round with my friends. And then it would respond to me saying, you spent 14 pounds out of your social pot on a round with your friends, you have 80 quid left. Great, I can buy another round. But maybe I don't let my mates know that. Then, the next application I built via SMS was Maura Bot. We were talking about health tech a little bit earlier. This was to allow people to be randomly notified for queries on their pain level throughout the day, and then marry it with their location and the current weather profile to be able to use machine learning to predict pain outcomes in the future. So I have some experience with building bots to solve medium-sized to small-sized problems. And when I say a bot, I just mean an SMS interfaced application. There's a couple reasons why this is beneficial. I've just explained the architecture of it. I will say selfishly, as a primarily back-end developer, it's great to write no HTML and no CSS and no JavaScript and just be able to have one single point in, one single point out, and model those interactions. And we actually had a very interesting discussion earlier talking about NLP and how we have those discussions via voice, because it's the same exact thing. You have one message going this way, another coming that way. Is it transactional? Is it a command? Is there a series of communications going back and forth? So we know that we want to get an application that can talk to the outside world, to interface to text, and interface with me. Now let's walk through how we put this together straightforward. First, I use Twilio. Show of hands, has anyone in here worked with Twilio before? Yes, yes, yes. Okay. It's incredibly handy. It's one of many services out there that allow you to send and receive and handle text messages in any language that you program in. And the documentation's really good. You could, if you are even day 5 programming, you could probably be sending out text in about 20 minutes. You go in, you configure, you get your API keys, you shove them into your application and get it configured. And before you know it, in about 8 to 10 lines of code, you're going to be able to send out SMS. So that's half the problem down. I can now send you things. If I know your number, I can send you SMS, whatever I want. Obviously, there's utilities for blocking that if you don't want me to be sending you things. But that gives us half of the equation. Then you wrap it into your Rails application, and you have to look at the other side. How am I going to receive text from you? Well, you go into Twilio, you purchase your phone number that's going to be handling this, and you configure it to point to an endpoint for your application. This is how it would look in Rails. Very simple, one line. It's going to be a post request. You can format it however you want. Mine's messages reply. And then you update that in Twilio. So now officially, if somebody texts that phone number, you have a text coming into your web application, and you can do whatever you want with it. So okay, this is the bare bones foundation of this house, of this product. Now comes the important part. Now comes thinking about the user interface and user interaction when your hands are really tied. You can't make anything pretty. You can't make beautiful modals. You can't make great animations. The experience literally has to be what comes in, what goes out. Is it expected? Can you handle errors? And is it satisfactory? So now that we have the bare bones, let's build our very first service for people. Checking the news. So I modeled the first few services off of this, of thinking if things were really bad, you know, because there is the annoyance of not being able to check into Facebook, Twitter, or Reddit. But let's look at the natural disaster. What's critical? If things went really bad and I had no access to information, I would want to know what's being said. What is the government declared? What are the police saying about the area? Are there, you know, how far have the invaders gotten through the country? With this, I use the News API integration. News API is a fantastic third-party service that has a tremendous amount of support with different programming languages, but also a tremendous amount of news sources. And this will give us the ability to call and send news articles. Now, how do you format this? From stage 1, every service is going to have a name, and the name's going to be called from a single command via text. That's how I set it up. So for this, for example, you text just the word news, doesn't matter if it's upcase, downcase, and it receives into the application. It checks, is the first argument of the text news? Then it passes it on to this service, then it calls the API, it gets the top 5 headlines in the UK. And then it parses them down to the headline, and then the source, and then about a 5 or 6 sentence description. We do have limits with SMS, and Twilio we can only send up to 1,600 characters. This is just for the MVP to get it working, so you can get that. But even more importantly, what if you're having a horrible situation happen, but it's not going to be the top 5 headlines in Britain at the moment? What if there's something crazy happening up in Glasgow and everyone's talking about it, but we're having a horrible time down in Penryn and we want to know what's going to happen? That's the second part. You can pass an argument by news, comma, the name of your query, and then the query will be sent to the API, and it will only send the top 5 headlines that match that query back to you. Here's it in action. You probably won't be searching Prince Philip. The other thing to consider is Right, we have the happy path. But with the happy path, we also have the bad and the sad path. What if things don't work? What if the API fails? What if the user sends something completely nonsensical? So with this chain, you have the text coming at one end. We first process it. Is it a valid user? Yes. Then it goes to the next. Is this a news command? No. Go to the next. And if it keeps going through the chain and it doesn't find any matches for the query that comes in, it's the final one, which is called something wrong, which sends a complete help command back to the user and explaining how they can interact with the application. And also saying, if you need help in the future, you can text help me, which also has its own part in the chain. And this is going to lead me on to, before we talk about other services, how do we extend this from here, right? If we want to add more services, we need to have a clear and simple architecture that is fluid and allows us to be able to add new services and capabilities quickly and easily. So we encapsulate all of our logic into individual services. And when I say services, I don't mean like a microservice architecture where it's talking over different servers or talking over different connections. This is one monolith application, Ruby talking to Ruby. It's conceptual services. So you have one that's sending your messages. You pass it the message, you pass it the number. You have one that's sending the news. Does it match the command for news? Does it have a query? It sends it out. And then you have the other services put into there. They're wrapped up in an Interactor, which is a design pattern from the Gang of Four back in the 90s, which does one business logic task. And that's how you put it together so things aren't speaking to other areas where they shouldn't be speaking, and you're able to get the use out of them and add and remove as needed. If you look at the chain, you chain these interactors together, and the text goes through and it looks up every single member of the chain. So if you want to add a new service, you just plop that bit of logic right in the middle, and then it calls on it, it sees if it matches, and it goes down to the end. Again, at the end is the something wrong. If we can't find a match for it, we'll say, we're sorry, we can't process this. If you need error handling on an API basis, you do it within the interactor and the service. So we have our architecture down. We know how we want to add another service so code doesn't get too crazy. We've got the news. What's the next most important thing? The weather. If you're in the case of a natural disaster, and this isn't just for we're in Cornwall and we like to talk about the weather, but if you are in the case of a natural disaster, the weather's going to be very, very important. Are we going to get 100-mile-an-hour winds? Do we have another Hurricane Ophelia coming over? Are we going to have blistering heat if we're in the case of a wildfire? I'd say in the case of a political attack, it wouldn't be as important. But for the natural disaster side, this is critical. I'd like to do a brief shout out to the integration for the Weather Underground API, because this is the last time I will ever talk about them. I've referenced them in a few talks. I've been using them for 5 years as a fantastic developer API, which allowed me to get fantastic weather data for years and years and years. And last year they killed their free option, and they replaced it with a minimum tier of $800 a month. So goodbye, Weather Underground. Hello, AccuWeather APIs. However, again, this is API agnostic. If you look online, there are dozens of weather APIs to let you get access to weather data. They all have their benefits, they all have their drawbacks. AccuWeather is fantastic because it actually is a free plan, but it's a little negative in that maximum on the free is 50 calls a day, but you can extend from there. So you build your service together, boom. Using the same flow as everywhere else, I get my interactor, which is passing to the text messenger service, and it's calling the separate service for the weather. However, we are gradually increasing in complexity for processing logic. Now we require a query. Now we have to be able to identify where someone is, right? Because you don't have geolocation access directly in SMS. The user has to be able to supply it. The user has to be able to supply it in one of a million different ways. If I do my postcode PL220BL, it has to handle that just as much as Lostwithiel, just as much as Lostwithiel, Cornwall, GBUK. So the first thing that you do is you check and require that the argument has been passed to weather, and then you hook into their locations API. Locations API, thank goodness, does that work for you. It will take in the human text entered version of the location and bring it out to a solid location key. Then you take the location key and you pass it into their weather API. Now this is the area of the product that I think has the most potential to expand, because there's a lot of information and variety that comes with weather. For the example today, and at the current alpha stage of this, we are taking the high and the low. We are taking the daytime single word forecast and the nighttime single word forecast, which they lovingly supplied in Fahrenheit. So for my wonderful audience today, the good old metric system, I transmogrified it back. And now we are able to, via the same portal, give a 5-day forecast for what's going to happen in the next 5 days. Again, MVP alpha, just 4 units. But now we have 2 things that we can do. We can find the top headlines, and we can figure out what the weather's going to be like for 5 days. And even just for a toy and not in a natural disaster, that's kind of useful and kind of fun. If you're just sitting on a beach in Cornwall with no 4G and you're wondering. Now, the third and final service at this point of the project, I feel like might get used the most because it would be useful not just in the extreme, but in the immediate circumstance. It's something that I would feel the pain of. And if you're going out and about, when I came here today, I used Google Maps, right? Because I'm a little unsure about which turn off. I don't come here every day. Make sure where the building is I need to go. So let's say getting around. If you know where you are and you know the name of where you need to be able to get coherent instructions on how to get there. And yes, in the extreme case, that's quite important. And even in the mild and moderate case, it's quite important. Maybe you have a dentist appointment in a part of town you've never been before, and you need to get there now on foot or by car. This one is the most complex because it's 3 arguments separated by a comma. And I probably shouldn't have chosen a comma as a delimiter because traditionally when you write out a long-form location, you use commas. So the only gotcha here is, and it will tell you, so we have the error handling, don't use commas when writing out your location. Please just use spaces. So you put in directions as the first argument. The second argument is your current location. So you could say Heartlands, Cornwall. And the third is the location you need to be, St. Austell or St. Austell, Cornwall. This integrates with the Google Locations and Directions API, which again, very gratefully allows you to leverage their power. I don't know if you've ever noticed, if you use Google Maps and you look up directions, it's incredibly forgiving. If it sees St. Austell, okay, we know where you are. Or if you write out a complete address in Luton, it'll know. The only limitation is you probably don't want to do directions over about 300 miles, which I think would be an unlikely use case anyway, because again, 1,600 character limit, you can only go so far. Here's an example of error handling. This is someone supplying one argument. And here's an example. It's quite a long text, so it only shows a few. So that's from my place to Bodmin. And it's separated in a particular format. I don't know if you remember early 2000s, late 90s MapQuest. When you get directions where you wanted to go, you'd print them out of your printer, and it would be one line of text. One line of text is to be, do this action, this amount of distance, do this action, this amount of distance. That's how it's put together. Those are our 3 services. That's the architecture, and that's the foundation upon which this is built to handle the extreme and also the mundane. It will work for the mundane. If O2 goes down, you will have this access. If you're at the beach, you will have this access as long as you have SMS. There's a few things we'd like to do to improve this in the future. 1, expand the weather offerings. We have the data right there. It'd be minimal effort to get more, but again, speaking about user interface and user experience, you don't want to do a wall of text. You want it to be incredibly usable and eye-parsable, even just via text output. Second is longer form news. So this is how this would work. You wouldn't be able to get all the long form news via the News API. However, individual news providers, such as the New York Times, will offer longer forms. So the step for this, slightly more technical, would be to allow another leg where the user could request the headlines and then select the headline they were interested in if it qualified for longer form, and then send back the response chunked back into 1,600 character chunks if they were desperate to know the entirety of that story in text. Allow community use and input. In fact, you may need your mobile phone in about 2 minutes. And then using that, extend features and commands. I think we probably have at least 6 more services we could easily put in. May even put in a few fun, jokey ones, but as you can see here, as long as you can connect to something and get information of any sort, you can be able to put it in. And then finally, notifications. So I believe it'd be quite useful for users to be able to communicate with the server, again, simply, to configure their notification preferences. Maybe you don't want to sit there texting the word news every 15 minutes. Maybe you want notifications if certain things come up, if certain queries match. Can you please tell me if that's coming on? And then also to end the queries and have complete management. So in wrapping up, and I'll actually show you the phone number of this for a sec so you can have it. I talked about a problem, and I talked about how I approached it and built through it. But really the moral that I like to put in this, and honestly in the last talk that I gave, is any of us who write code or build software or work in tech or work with applications every day have a superpower, and we have a set of skills to be able to help others, to give back, to create, to be creative. And I think that it's important to never forget that. I'll go through weeks at work, which is great. I love my job. It's very fulfilling, but I'll get that glaze. I'll get that kind of, okay, it's a job. Like when I used to work at the sawmill or when I used to work at the pizza factory, like I'm getting my paycheck, it's my job, that's why I'm here. But once in a while, you can work on something and try and actually be useful and help others. And even if you don't, even if it just helps yourself or makes you mildly interested, it's worth your time. I think it's so important to give back and to be able to show others that that's okay. And you know what? If you don't have the time or you're too busy, that's fine. There's no guilt here. But I'm just saying that we all have this superpower and we're so lucky to have it. So I'd like to thank you for your time. There's the number right there if you want it. And actually, you should take it and break it and then email me about why it's so broken and awful. And there's all the places you can reach me. I write at schwad.github.io. And thank you very much. I'll be around later if you want to talk about this. But thank you for having me.